We are going to study the book of Esther tonight, if you can make your way there. Esther chapter 4. As we've kind of been on this journey of the story of Esther, we've been encountered and we've come into contact with some different characters. So Esther, this young woman, she was an orphan. Her parents, we don't know much about, but they had passed away. She's an exile in this foreign land, so she's not where she's from. Her uncle takes her in. His name is Mordecai. Her uncle, who has a position in the citadel of Susa, so he's with the king in the citadel. He has a place of somewhat of providence, and as he's placed in a place of position, the queen defies the order at a drunken party of the king, defies the order, Queen Vashti, and she's banished, never to see the king again. What ends up happening, the king, because he's really upset about it, wants to find a new queen. So instead of mending the relationship that he made a mess of, he says, let's just find somebody else to take your place. So he does. So he does a search, and this young girl, Esther, has been brought with all these other women to the capital. They have this kind of beauty pageant thing. She gets selected as the new queen. And as the story continues, we're introduced kind of to the villain of the whole story. His name is Haman. Haman, as we know, is not Jewish. He has no affection for other people other than himself. He's a very prideful individual. So Haman's plight, Haman's story, is that of exaltation. The king makes him the number 2 guy, in some sense, over all the other nobles. So Haman's fame has been spreading through the land. Part of the story, though, in Haman, in his story, is that he has this incredible allure to power. Power makes what makes him tick. It's how he processes the world. Well, Mordecai, being a Jew, will not give any allegiance to this man named Haman. Haman gets so outraged by this. He says, what I'm going to do because of this is I'm going to wipe out not only Mordecai, I'm going to wipe out all his people. So this power that had corrupted him as this individual, as this noble, now spreads to not only Mordecai, but I want to get rid of anybody that's related to this person. So we're going to wipe out all these people throughout the land. So the story kind of picks up for us that this guy Haman, with the king's permission, grants a decree so all the world knows that they're going to wipe out on a certain day of the week. They're going to wipe out all these people, a mass genocide of an ethnic group. So the story picks up, chapter 4, verse 1. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he only went as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and the order of the king came, there was a great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of the sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He has also given a copy of the text of the edict of their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and explain to her. And he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence, to beg for mercy, and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and the people of the royal province know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I've been called to go to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to this royal position for such a time as this? Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai, go, Gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out his gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." "Bring Haman at once," the king said, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Esther replied, my request is this: if the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet. I will prepare for them, then I will answer the king's question." So this story here that we're introduced to is kind of like a roller coaster ride. You have these characters interacting with each other, and what they're talking about is some really heavy things. And as the story progresses, what we'll see is that through Mordecai's distress and Esther's plea, how God, who his name is not mentioned throughout the book, how God is working in the hearts of people. Through Mordecai's distress, Esther's plea, God is governing or working in the heart of the king. One of the things that's to note here about this story is that in chapter 4, verse 1, this character Mordecai learned of all that had been done. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the city wailing loudly and bitterly. One of the instructions that Mordecai had forbade Esther to do was to reveal her ethnicity. Do not tell anybody you're Jewish. Do not do that. You just go in there, you don't mention it, you don't talk about it, you don't mention a thing. But what he's doing right here, and how the story progresses, in Mordecai's refusal to bow down to Haman, his refusal to give him allegiance. And what we looked at is kind of an imagery of how King Saul was to wipe out a people group, these Amalekites, and how Haman taking on the mantle of, I'm not giving allegiance to nobody, no person. And so what we see here in this story here is, though, that now what Mordecai does is does something incredibly Jewish. He rips his clothes. It's something that they would do, sackcloth and ashes, and he would wail. So it's kind of a really interesting start of the story. His distress is so great. All the people, as it says here in verse 3, in every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. Anybody that was a Jew, after hearing this edict, had one thing. They ripped their clothes, they put on these sackcloth, they had ashes they put on themselves, and they mourned. So they're revealing who they are, what has happened to them, and what will happen to them. This distress that Mordecai shows is something that the people of Israel constantly did, as what they did is they would reach out or cry out to God. In ancient times, for instance, these rites were believed to be a way of turning away God's anger or his wrath. For instance, in 1 Kings chapter 21 and verse 27, Ahab heard these words. He tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and fasted. He lay in sackcloth and went around meekly. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite. Have you noticed how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because he has humbled himself, I will not bring this disaster in this day, but I will bring it on his house in the days of his son. So what Mordecai is doing is outwardly showing two things. The reality of this edict has not only an effect on me, an effect on my people, But what I'm doing in distress is calling out to God. I'm calling out to him. God, would you turn your anger? Will you turn your face away from the plight that's going to happen? Would you do that? Now, what I find also striking is, where does he make his plea at? Look at what it says here. He does this, tears his clothes, wailing loudly and bitterly. Verse 2, but he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. He's in public. He goes into the highly visible, a place where a lot of people gather together, and he wants people to know. He's like, I am in distress. The irony of the whole story, I mean, think about it. Everybody knows that the Jewish people are going to get wiped out, except for whom? Esther. So here's this person in the capital with all these attendants, all these people, and she doesn't know of an edict that was sent out to wipe her people out. So what does Mordecai do? In some way, he's getting Esther's attention. She has no idea the reality that's around her. So he goes as far as possible up to the gate. He knows he's not allowed into the gate. Esther's in the capital. Haman, this incredibly bright and brilliant and prideful, kind of scandalous individual, is making sure everybody knows his power and his wealth. So what does Mordecai do? He goes up to the gate in sackcloth and ashes, and he is wailing loudly, so everybody could hear it. So what happens in the story? Verse 4, when Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. Now, the question is why? So what is she in distress of? And so I think the narrative of what it's telling, she doesn't know why he's doing this. But what he is doing is revealing his ethnicity. Now, so that everybody knows he's Jewish. So everybody knows that he's in great mourning. So what does Esther do? She sent clothes for him to put on instead of the sackcloth, but he would not accept them. In some way, and the commentators go back and forth on this, and it's just a really interesting thing. Either Esther is like, hey, why don't you knock it off, Mordecai? You're playing our cards. You told me not to play the card, that we're Jewish, and here you are out there wailing, here's some clothes, gets your clothes on, and get out of there. But Mordecai's like, no, it's time. It's time. So, because Esther's not allowed to talk to him, he's not in the inner gate. She sends one of these eunuchs to go talk to him. And he tells him, hey, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go tell Esther that the time's up and that God has called us and brought us to this place, and it's time to reveal the thing that I've told you for years not to reveal. You're going to have to make a stand. Because where you're at, you are not safe from this edict. You are not safe from these things. You will fall like the rest of us. So the message goes back to her. And so he goes, just to show you how severe this is, he's willing to put a lot of money, a lot of wealth behind the decision to make this a reality. I find that as he's starting to explain that, verse 7, Haman has promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. If you're Esther at this moment, what would be brought to your attention? When I was a child, I was brought into a foreign land, or my parents grew up in a foreign land, not by their choice. I was oppressed. My people have been oppressed. I've been given a great place of prominence throughout the world. I'm the queen of the most powerful person alive. And when he says, listen, this guy will not stop until it costs him a tremendous amount of wealth to destroy you and our people, you can imagine the flood and the memories coming back to her as an orphan, as a child who lost both of her parents in a foreign land that's not her home. So Esther at this moment, a person that could possibly be complacent because of her position of power, of prominence, of all these attendants, now what she does is she responds back to Mordecai. There's a level of soberness in her response. And this is what she says. She talks to him as she reports back. You know, verse 13, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you are alone, he tells her. If you remain silent, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. And so she says, verse 15, she says, go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away, carried out all of Esther's instructions. So Esther at this moment has to make a choice based on the reality of the situation she's in. She did not choose to be here. She did not choose to be part of this harem. She did not choose to be selected. But what we find in Esther's story is that she constantly finds favor wherever she goes. Favor with this head person that put her in charge or gave her all the things she needed to be presented to the king. She found favor with the king. She's in a place of favor. And now what Mordecai says is God has given you this favor and influence, and you have to use it for the sake of other people. You have to boldly go to the king. And she's like, do you realize if I do this, I could die? And she has to make a decision. What will she do with the influence and favor that she's been given? So she says, I'll go. I will go before the king. So chapter 5, verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting at his throne, royal throne in the hall, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out his gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. At this moment here, Esther, it's all boiling down to this moment. Will the king accept me in this inner hall? Will the favor that I've received from the king before, will it still be there? She goes in, the king recognizes her, he puts the scepter, she touches the scepter, and then she makes her request. This is very familiar if you're a Jewish person. This place of exile, this place of oppression is not the first time that they've seen it. Let alone, this is not a time that they can relate with. This is a time that they can relate with more than any other time. The last time that this had happened in their story was in the time of the Exodus. The Exodus was a moment in history where all the people of Israel were under Egyptian rule. The Pharaoh was harsh with them. He put so much task on them. He beat them down. The people of Israel cried out and they said, will you please send us help, God? Will you do something about it? In some way, what's happening here when the queen approaches the king is talking about how Moses went in front of the Pharaoh. So this is a place that the people are in exile, they're being oppressed, and ready to be annihilated, and she has to make a bold step to go before the most powerful person in the world to ask for favor. In the same way God had called Moses to ask the king of Pharaoh for favor for his people. And so this moment right here, when the queen goes up, this should be striking the chords of people's heart. That God raises people up. As he raises them, they speak with influence on the behalf of others for the sake of this people. You know, in Moses' story, Moses actually tells God, Exodus 3:13, he goes, pardon your servant, Lord, please send somebody else. Moses wasn't willing. In the same way, Esther had met with reservations of, should I go to the king? So when she actually makes the decision, she gets all dressed up and she walks in the room, it's her dealing with the doubts, the reality of her death, the reality of her people's death, just like Moses did. The story even in Exodus chapter 10, Pharaoh said to Moses, get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die. And here's the point. What Esther had to do to move into this place, to take the place of influence, to step out in faith before the king, this is reminiscent of this people's story. in what the story of faith is really all about. Here she is as kind of a type of a Moses. She has to, by faith, step in front of the king, not sure if her own fate will be jeopardized for the sake of other people. Another thing that's going on in the story of Esther, that's underneath the hood of this story, is this. This is from a commentator, here's what he says. If Esther's intercession, when she goes on behalf of the people, is what she's doing. She's interceding for a group of people. She's coming on their behalf to seek favor and restitution of this people. So it says this, if Esther's intercession occurs immediately at the conclusion of the 3-day fast, and if the fast immediately followed the issuance of the genocidal decree on the 13th of the first month, then she approached the king during Passover. So think of the implication of what's going on here. The timing of how all of this is overlaid is this. The story of Esther is meant to bring you back to the story of the Exodus. The time that Esther is interceding on behalf of the people of Israel, all these Jewish people in exile, is the same time of the year that they are to celebrate the Passover, which is what? When God delivered them from exile. They're supposed to celebrate the Passover. See, the holiday of Purim, in this moment of decree, of this moment where Esther's going in to seek the freedom, she's going in, the commentators suggest, at the same time when they'd be celebrating the Passover. When what would happen? That God would deliver their people from oppression. He goes, the dates kind of work out to be that way. So as she's there, maybe she's thinking about the exile. Maybe as a Jew, she remembers her story. Hey, Esther, God's delivered you before. God's rescued you before. Do you think he's not capable of doing it now? And if he is capable of doing it now, what do you have to fear? So when she makes the statement, if I perish, I perish, I think there's this motif, there's something going on in a broader stroke that God is trying to communicate to not only us, but to the people of Israel. The last part is this, Mordecai's distress, Esther's plea, and God's governing, or God's ruling of the heart of people. Esther's plea is this, verse 2 of chapter 5. When the king saw the queen, Esther, her only thing was, I just want to be able to make the request. I want to have favor in the king's eyes. When he saw the queen, Esther, standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out his gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. This acceptance, this favor that Esther was looking for is reminiscent of God giving the people of Israel, as they fled out of Egypt, favor from the Egyptians. It says in Exodus 12, the Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. What's happening right now is she knows, God, I know you are over all of this. You are in control of this whole situation. How do I know? The king will grant me favor like he granted my people favor at the Passover, like he granted the people as they came out of exile favor. So when I go in there by faith and I risk myself, my reputation, everything I have, to the point of even my own life, I'm going to rely on your promises that you deliver people from exile. That's what I'm going to rely on. And as she goes in there, and she steps in there, she's granted favor. Now here's the problem. She goes, when the king asks the question, she doesn't pony up with her what she wants. She doesn't tell him, hey, listen, king, here's the deal. This guy Haman that you really like, he's trying to kill me and all my people, and I'm really upset about it. So she's given an opportunity to speak. She's given favor from the king, up to half the kingdom, and all she says is, hey, do you want a drink? I'm really thirsty. I have a party. I just happen to have this banquet all built out, and would you come out to my banquet? And she goes, I want you to invite Haman out there too. And he's like, all right, I love drinking. I don't know how many times in Esther you see the king drinking. He's always constantly drinking. So she's like, well, I'm going to butter him up a little bit. We'll get him drunk. Then I'll let him know about the issue, and that's what's going to happen. So what did he do? Verse 6, as they were drinking wine, I mean, it tells you in the story. It's there for a reason. As they're drinking wine, the king again asks Esther, now what is your petition? And the thing is, will she respond in faith at a cost to herself? What will she ask? She goes, you know what I really want, king? Verse 8, if the king regards me with my favor, if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow. And so the irony of the story is this at the end of it. She's given the place of influence, but because of the circumstance and of the pressure, she doesn't take the step. So the question is, you're like, well, hey, Esther, God's delivered you before, your people before. You've been given a place of prominence, and here's what happens. We get overwhelmed by the reality that's in front of us. We get choked up. We don't have the words or the courage. We're not really sure how to say it. We're not sure, will it be received or will I be rejected? So what she does is like, well, you know what? I can't do this. She takes a step back and says, will you come tomorrow? This is a lot for me. There's a lot riding on my request. With the person there that is a very powerful person, I'm not sure how the king's going to do it. And so here's the irony of the last bit of this. The irony of the last bit is this. This last clause in verse 8, then she goes, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet. I'll prepare for them. Then I'll answer the king's request. I love what this quote. The last clause of verse 8 would seem to mean that at the second banquet, Esther will indeed reveal her deepest wish. And it says, the die is cast, but it's not Haman's lot. This whole story is about fate. Will the God of the universe, who's created all things, will he do what's right? Will he love his people? Will he protect them? Will he make a name for himself? Will he come again? What will this God do? Because it's set and it's told with this villain Haman, who he believes his fate's from the stars. These other gods will protect me. It says earlier that he would cast lots. So this holiday, this festival of Purim, it means to cast a lot. So what's happening at the very end is this. Who will win? And what we see here is Haman in pride. We see Haman in this aggressive approach, using power and influence to bring oppression. And then you see God taking this girl who had lost her family in a foreign land, brought to a place of prominence and power. And he asks her, will you take a step of faith? And will you use your influence to provide protection? Will you speak up so that I will make my case known through you? You know, I think then the application is this. A lot of times when we use our influence to do good, to speak truth, that a lot of times we feel it's on us. Like it's our truth that we came up with, that we have to defend something. When really what Esther is doing is this. She's speaking about what God wants to do. She's speaking about God's provision. She's speaking to the king, says, King, you basically gave this guy permission to wipe me out. And are you okay with that? Are you okay with that? And the king, and what God does through the king in his influence, and we'll find out later in the story what happens, is that God will use that moment that Esther takes as a step of faith to bring justice. And so the story for us as Christians is this, that when Jesus came to the earth, when Jesus suffered, when Jesus did all the things that he did, Jesus saw the end. Jesus saw what would happen after all of it. And the perspective that Jesus had through all of it, his focus of what God was going to accomplish, what he was going to accomplish on the other side of his pain, he knew it. And here's the thing with Esther. She doesn't know. But by faith, she's trusting God that he has said what he's going to say and do what he's going to do. It says this, and finish off with this idea. The story of the gospel, the story of our faith is this. When we have been asked to not only take steps of faith, You have to realize on the other side of the pain that you're stepping in now, that you feel, the pressure, all those things that are pushing down on you, is to realize that God has given you strength. He's equipped you in the way that you are because he's coming by his Spirit to empower you. And a lot of times I think Esther's fear and her hesitation is she's scared of what would happen. I mean, all of us would be. But this is what gave Jesus such great courage. What Jesus, as he made his plea to the world, as he stood amongst people that mocked him and ridiculed him, that rejected him. Hebrews chapter 12, finish off with this verse. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And so he finishes off, and the Hebrew writer says this: consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Part of walking in faith is having to walk through difficult things. Part of walking in faith is mean that you have to step into pain and not run away from it. Not that you want it. Jesus didn't want to be scourged and beat and mocked, but what he knew was the joy of his Father throughout the midst of the pain gave him the power to walk through it. Gave him the power to stand in the midst of really bad situation. He was on a cross, nailed, and he goes, there was joy that was set before him. And so the journey of faith, the journey of our faith as a Christian is knowing that God governs the heart of men, that God's in control, and I can trust him. And we have the story of Esther to encourage us. Will God deliver them a second time? Will he do a second removing of these disobedient, disgruntled people that have caused a lot of the problems for themselves? Will he still come to their rescue? Will he bring them out of exile? And it's no irony, it's no coincidence that when Esther's asking, it's at the same time God had already delivered them before in the past. And he'll continue to deliver his people. And what he does is he gives us faith, though, to do what? To make the request, to press into him, to love him, because you know what? He truly loves us. And when we find ourselves in situations of pain that we've caused to ourselves, you know what? He's still there. And he will give us the strength and the grace to walk through that. How? God, I need your help. I confess my sin to you, screwed it up. But I know that you're faithful to rescue me from exile, to rescue me from a place of pain and of anguish that maybe I caused or has been put upon me. But God, will you deliver me? And that's the beautiful thing about the story of Esther, is God's constant hand working through the background of people's faith and their response to his faithfulness. So let's pray together. So Lord Jesus, we thank you for this night. We thank you for your faithfulness to us. Lord, we thank you, Lord, that that you worked through this story of Esther, through this story of Passover, of redeeming your people. And here Esther comes by faith in this crazy moment of anguish of a people, and by faith she takes a step. And Lord, I just pray that you would encourage us to take steps of faith every day, realizing that you're for us, and Lord, that you've forgiven us from our sins, the things that we've made mistakes in our life. God, you've covered that by your blood. And you are releasing us into this world to use our influence to do what you've called us to do. So Lord, thank you for this night. In your name we pray.